The man known to history as Sir Francis Walsingham was born at some unknown date in the early 1530s, with most scholars believing his year of birth to be 1532. He hailed from Kent, most likely from the small town of Chislehurst, which today is a suburb of London, but which was then well to the south of the city. His father was William Walsingham, a successful lawyer of the time who had connections to government officials and senior nobles in the English capital. A brother of his, Francis's uncle Edmund, was a senior official in the administration of the Tower of London, a building which in early modern times served as both a prison and as the main fortress of the English capital. The Walsinghams had originally been based out of the capital in the late medieval period, where their success as vintners had allowed an ancestor to buy a large manor outside Chislehurst and to establish themselves as a leading gentry family in Kent. Francis's mother was Joyce Denny, a scion of the prominent Denny family who were influential in Hertfordshire north of London. Francis was her and William's only son, though they had 4 daughters who survived childhood as well: Barbara, Christina, Elizabeth, and Mary, and possibly others who died in infancy. Joyce would largely raise the children without their biological father, as William Walsingham died in 1534 when Francis was very young, and he never knew his father. Francis Walsingham's life was shaped utterly by the wider political events which played out in England in the 1530s when he was just a child, particularly in the sphere of religion. The Protestant Reformation had begun in Germany back in 1517, when Martin Luther produced his 95 Theses as an attack on the Roman Catholic Church. The protest against Rome spread across large parts of Central and Northern Europe in the 1520s. In England, the new Protestant movement found adherents amongst small groups of people, often from mercantile and governmental backgrounds in the cities and towns. But King Henry VIII was virulently opposed to Protestantism and had even written a staunch defense of the Roman Catholic Church, which had led Pope Leo X to bestow the title of Defender of the Faith on the English monarch. Things changed, though, during the early to mid-1530s, while Francis was just an infant. During these years, in an effort to acquire a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and sire a legitimate male heir by marrying his mistress, Anne Boleyn, Henry had split from Rome and made himself supreme head of the Church of England. This created a new Anglican Church, which remained Catholic in most doctrinal senses. But Henry was now surrounded by a growing number of Protestant officials and nobles, and in the mid-1530s they used their influence with him to reform the Church along Protestant lines. Yet England remained a country where Catholicism was still dominant. The battle to preserve the Protestant religious settlement would shape the entirety of Walsingham's life.
This video is sponsored by Magellan TV, the amazing documentary platform that covers ancient and modern history, science, the earth and nature, as well as historical drama. The site showcases real stories that have played a role in defining the past, which act to shape our future. Sir Francis Walsingham himself helped shape history by being spymaster for Queen Elizabeth I. On Magellan TV, we recently watched She-Wolves, the early queens of England, which has an episode including Elizabeth. She was the courageous Virgin Queen whose motto was always the same. She stood up to the invasion threatened by the Spanish Armada and did so with the aid of her ministers and advisors like Sir Francis Walsingham. She was a woman who was a supreme ruler in a man's world. To find out more about Elizabeth I, why not try Magellan TV? There are no advertisements, and you can watch content anytime, anywhere on your TV, laptop or mobile device. And with new 4K content being added weekly, you will always have something entertaining and intellectually stimulating to watch. And with an annual membership, you pay only $4.99 per month, or pay monthly for just $5.99 per month for over 3,500 hours of viewing time. Click the link in the description box to get a 30 free days trial to watch She-Wolves, the Early Queens of England, and all the rest of Magellan TV's extensive collection of over 3,000 documentaries.
The details that are available for Francis's early life are very thin. His mother remarried to John Carey, a cousin of Henry Carey, Lord Hudson, almost immediately after Francis's father died in 1534. The Careys were connected to the Boleyn faction at the royal court, and so, as Walsingham grew up, he moved on the fringes of the court in London and aristocratic circles. These connections were not always a guarantee of success. After marrying the king, Anne Boleyn had given birth to a daughter named Elizabeth, but no male heir arrived, and she was soon implicated in a court conspiracy and executed. A conspiracy that was probably invented to allow Henry to marry again and to demote the Boleyn faction. How Francis might have reacted to any of this is unclear, though we do know that in the 1540s, as he grew up, he adopted the Protestant faith, which was adhered to by a number of the Careys. His Protestantism would have been strengthened by his arrival in King's College, Cambridge in the mid-1540s during his teenage years, a college within the university which was known for its Protestant culture. He continued his training at Gray's Inn, one of the legal training schools in London, in the early 1550s. These were good years for England's minority Protestant community, as the son and heir which had eventually resulted from Henry VIII's third marriage to Jane Seymour, Edward VI, succeeded in 1547 and ruled down to 1553, with the minority government dominated by advanced Protestants who introduced a more thoroughgoing Protestant Reformation in the late 1540s and early 1550s. Disaster struck in the summer of 1553. Edward VI's health deteriorated sharply, and he died in early July that year. The Protestant lords and ministers who surrounded Edward then attempted an abortive coup of sorts to impose their own candidate as the successor to the throne, Lady Jane Grey. But they were foiled by Princess Mary, Henry VIII's eldest daughter from his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Mary foiled the attempt to establish Jane as queen and rose to the throne as Queen Mary I of England. With this, the Protestant Reformation, which had been gradually developed over the past 20 years, seemed to be at an end. Mary had been raised as an ardent Roman Catholic by her mother, and the humiliation and ill treatment of her mother by the Protestants who had surrounded Henry and his son in the 1530s and 1540s had not only left her determined to reimpose Catholicism, but also possessed of a hatred of the Protestants in England. Over the next 5 years, as she reigned between 1553 and 1558, Mary restored England's ties to Rome and imposed a brutal crackdown on Protestantism in England and Wales, with hundreds of Protestants burnt alive as heretics at the stake. Her reputation as Bloody Mary was exaggerated by Protestant propagandists in later decades, yet there is no doubting that Protestants were not safe in England during her rule. Hundreds fled the country for the continent, forming communities of English Protestant exiles in advanced Protestant cities such as Geneva, Basel and Strasbourg in the Swiss cantons and Western Germany, during the mid-1550s. Walsingham had already visited the continent before Mary ascended to the throne of England. In between his studies at Cambridge and entering Gray's Inn, he had visited mainland Europe in 1550 and 1551. When the Protestant regime was overthrown in the summer of 1553, and as the possibility of his finding career advancement as a Protestant in England collapsed, he left again for the continent. His exact movements over the next 5 years can only be traced in outline from the available evidence. We know he was studying civil law at the University of Padua in northern Italy in 1555, where he was recorded as being a representative of the English student contingent there. Thereafter, he drifted north to the Swiss cantons. Cities like Geneva and Basel had become the most radically Protestant regions of Europe by the 1550s, following the teachings of Jean Calvin at Geneva in the 1530s and 1540s. Calvinism, the branch of Protestantism which is named after him, had gone much further than Lutheranism in arguing that any forms of wealth and material trappings needed to be removed from churches to remove any traces of idolatry, as well as allowing for a simple Mass spoken in the vernacular languages rather than Latin, and being rooted in close and precise study of Scripture. Here in the Alps and the hills around them in the mid-1550s, many English Protestant exiles like Walsingham were not just galvanized in their beliefs, but adopted an even more purist form of Protestantism. In later times, they would become known as the Puritans back in England. For Francis and others like him in Geneva, Basel and Strasbourg in 1556 and 1557, it must have seemed like they would spend much of their lives living there in their small communities of expat English Protestants on the continent. There seemed to be no prospect of Mary tolerating Protestants at home in England, and in fact, she had married Prince Philip of Spain in 1554, a figure who would go on to become a bitter opponent of Protestantism across Europe as King Philip II between the late 1550s and his death 40 years later. But then, as many were resigning themselves to Mary ruling England as a bastion of Catholicism for decades to come, news arrived that after a phantom pregnancy and apparent miscarriage in early 1558, Mary's health had deteriorated sharply. She died in November 1558. The exact cause of her death is not clear, though cancer of some kind seems probable, combined with other complicating illnesses. With her passing, her half-sister Elizabeth, the child that had been born during Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's brief time as husband and wife, succeeded her. And, as the daughter of Anne Boleyn, it was clear that Elizabeth would favour a return to Protestantism of some kind. With this, many of the Protestant exiles on the continent began flocking back home to England. Walsingham was among them, and he had returned to his native Kent by early 1559. Shortly after he arrived back in England, Walsingham obtained the first important position in his political life when he was returned for the constituency of Bossiney in the House of Commons in the Elizabethan Parliament. Parliaments only sat intermittently in early modern times. They were particularly active in the first 2 years of Elizabeth's reign as a wide range of reforms were introduced to overhaul the reforms Mary had brought in from 1553 onwards. Most importantly, in conjunction with the Queen and her ministers on the Privy Council, the Parliament oversaw the introduction of the Elizabethan religious settlement. This recreated a Protestant Church of England which was organised in line with Elizabeth's religious views. What this meant was that it was a very moderate form of Protestantism which retained many elements of Catholicism, though while splitting again entirely from Rome. Walsingham and many others who had lived in the Swiss cantons as Marian exiles in the mid-1550s would never be fully reconciled to this lukewarm form of Protestantism. To a substantial extent, he would spend his political career, along with other senior politicians of the Elizabethan age, trying to coerce Elizabeth into allowing the creation of a more puritanical or Calvinist Church of England. While we know that Walsingham sat in Parliament in 1559 and was elected to sit in Parliament again in 1563 to represent the constituency of Lyme Regis, there is a considerable lack of available evidence for Walsingham's career during the first decade of Elizabeth's reign. This is unusual for a figure who would rise to become the English Secretary of State in the 1570s. The reason for this dearth of information on his early career is that Walsingham's private papers and personal correspondence were largely lost in the 17th century. While caches of his papers were collected by antiquarians and today are found dispersed through various collections in the British Library, many of his writings no longer survive. As a result, unlike contemporaries of his, such as his predecessor in the office of Secretary of State, Sir William Cecil, the details of Walsingham's career in the early and mid-1560s are somewhat opaque. What is clear is that as well as sitting in Parliament from time to time, he had acquired a position working under Cecil in London. At this juncture, his role was as an intelligencer, someone who gathered information for the regime to protect it from potential Catholic conspirators. In this, Walsingham began to draw on networks of contacts which he had on the continent from his years there in Italy, the Swiss cantons, and France. It was a role he would perform for the rest of his life in one form or another, as we will see. While the exact specifics of Walsingham's political career for much of the 1560s may be unknown to us, we know how his personal affairs developed during these years. In 1562, he married for the first time. His wife on this occasion was Anne Barne, a daughter of George Barne, who had been the Sheriff of London in 1545 and was elected as Lord Mayor of London in 1552. Anne, however, died in 1564, just a year and a half after she and Francis married. Hence, 2 years later, in 1566, Francis remarried, this time to Ursula St Barbe, a daughter of Henry St Barbe, a prominent member of the gentry in Somerset. They would have 2 children in due course, both daughters. Frances, with an E, was born in October 1567, named after her father as though he already knew he would not have any sons, while 6 years later a girl, Mary, arrived. Ursula shared her husband's devout Protestantism. They also moved in fairly austere puritanical circles of the gentry and people they were circuitously related to at court and in London. The world of Elizabethan politics was a very narrow place of a few thousand people who knew each other very well, and the connections which the Walsinghams developed in the 1560s would have shaped their social world for decades to come. Meanwhile, as the years went by, they increasingly lived in London, where they had a home in Seething Lane near Tower Hill by the Tower of London. Yet Walsingham also retained lands in and ties to his native Kent. This was a common development of well-to-do members of the gentry and the minor nobility who often had both a London residence where they worked from and a country seat that they retired to during periods of respite or when waves of the plague hit London and the only way to get out of harm's way was to leave the capital altogether. Within a few years of his marriage to Ursula, Francis's career began to accelerate dramatically under the patronage of his old university acquaintance, William Cecil. Cecil was the most powerful politician of the reign of Elizabeth I, a man who served as Secretary of State in the 1560s and afterwards took charge of the state finances when he became Lord Treasurer of England. Walsingham's list of responsibilities under Cecil expanded in the late 1560s and early 1570s from his role as an intelligencer to increasingly performing a range of secretarial tasks and also acting as a diplomat. Over time, his political connections were also expanding as his sisters married a number of rising officials and politicians. His sister Mary married Sir Walter Mildmay, a figure who had risen in service to the government of King Edward VI in the early 1550s and who quickly became the treasurer of the royal household under Elizabeth. In the 1560s, he became the Chancellor of the English Exchequer. Another of Walsingham's sisters, Elizabeth, married Sir Peter Wentworth. He was not as closely associated with the government, but in the 1570s he emerged as a leading voice, calling for further Protestant religious reform in the English Parliament, further emphasising Francis's enmeshment in the advanced Protestant circles of London and England during Elizabeth's reign. Walsingham's path to senior office really began in the early 1570s when he was appointed to form part of an English diplomatic mission which was sent to France in the summer of 1570. The French were in the first stages of a period of 4 decades of domestic conflict known as the French Wars of Religion, a clash between Catholics and Protestants, the latter of which were known as Huguenots in France. The majority of the population were still Catholics, but, as in England, a substantial proportion of people who lived in the cities and towns and the gentry and minor nobility had adopted Protestantism, making it hard for the government to ignore their calls for tolerance. The mission Walsingham arrived in France as part of in the summer of 1570 was sent by Queen Elizabeth to petition King Charles IX of France to provide greater religious toleration for the Huguenots. He evidently did well enough during the exchanges in Paris that when the English ambassador to France, Sir Henry Norris, was recalled shortly afterwards, Walsingham was appointed as his successor. He spent the next 2.5 years in Paris performing this role. It was a major apprenticeship in senior political office. In the early autumn of 1572, nearly 2 years into his tenure as English ambassador in Paris, Walsingham was witness to one of the most infamous episodes in the history of Europe's wars of religion. That mid-August, thousands of political and aristocratic figures had gathered in Paris for the marriage of King Charles's sister Margaret, or Margot, to Prince Henry of Navarre, head of the House of Bourbon. Henry was a leader of the French Huguenots, and the marriage held out the possibility of a lasting peace between Catholics and Protestants. But it didn't turn out in this way. The marriage was celebrated on the 18th of August. 5 days later, as the celebrations were winding down and hangovers were being nursed across the city, violence broke out on the night of the 23rd of August. It spiraled out of control in the hours that followed, with Huguenots murdered in enormous numbers across the city of Paris and beyond on the 24th of August, St Bartholomew's Day. Amongst the thousands of French Protestants who were eventually killed was one of their foremost leaders, Gaspard de Coligny, Seigneur of Chantillon. As the streets of Paris literally ran red with blood, Walsingham and his staff sheltered many Protestants in their homes in the French capital. It was a defining moment for Francis. After the St Bartholomew's Day massacre, he was convinced that the Catholics of Europe would not refrain from any action to try to crush the Protestant Reformation in countries like England and France, and henceforth his perception of himself was as a zealous defender of the Protestant religious settlement in England in a religious war across the continent that seemed to have no end. Walsingham remained on in Paris as English ambassador there for several months following the massacre, as renewed war broke out across the country between the government and Catholic lords, such as the Duke of Guise, and the Protestants led by Navarre. Events in England soon led to his recall, though. Cecil had moved from the office of Secretary of State to become Lord High Treasurer in the summer of 1572. He had been succeeded by Sir Thomas Smith, an able humanist scholar and former ambassador to France himself. However, Smith was nearing his 60th year, and it was evident that his appointment was a stopgap measure rather than a long-term solution. Shortly after he arrived home in England from France in the late spring of 1573, Walsingham was mooted for the position, and later that year he was appointed as co-secretary with Smith, though he would perform more and more of the duties himself over time in the mid-1570s, and was secretary on his own from 1577 onwards after Smith's death. This was an enormously powerful position. Secretaries of State, or indeed private secretaries to nobles and officials in early modern times, were people of considerable influence, their title literally meaning the keeper of secrets, the individual who managed the correspondence of government and who ran the royal secretariat, a coterie of scribes and clerks who were the embryonic version of the modern civil service. It was to this office that Walsingham, after his 2.5-year stint as ambassador in France, was appointed in 1573. It was something of an unusual, almost mercurial rise to power for a figure who had operated behind the scenes in such a shadowy manner in the 1560s. As Secretary of State, Walsingham was tasked with managing a wide array of problems that were facing the English government. Chief amongst these was England's international position. England was viewed as something of a pariah state in the second half of the 16th century in Europe, particularly in Spain, where King Philip II entertained hopes of using Spain's immense riches and military power to pull England back into the Catholic fold, as it had been by his deceased wife Mary. He would never abandon his hopes of reclaiming the kingdom he had briefly been king of back in the mid-1550s. Philip's views were mirrored in Rome by a succession of popes. Such was the antipathy towards England and its Protestant experiment that in 1570 Pope Pius V had issued a papal bull entitled Regnans in Excelsis, through which he excommunicated Queen Elizabeth. The hostility of Spain and the papacy, combined with the events in France on St Bartholomew's Day while Walsingham was ambassador there in 1572, had convinced many advanced Protestants, like Walsingham, that they were locked in a deadly struggle to preserve the Protestant settlement in England against the instruments of the Antichrist in Rome. It was not simply abroad that the danger lay. There were challenges which England faced, and which Walsingham became central to confronting in 1573 when appointed as secretary, which lay much closer to home. One lay across the Irish Sea in Ireland. The country had only ever been half conquered by England in the High Middle Ages and had become a hotbed of opposition to the rule of Elizabeth's grandfather, King Henry VII, back in the late 15th century. Henry VIII had initiated a program of conquest there to reduce the island firmly to English rule and end its position as a security threat to the wider Tudor state, but progress was slow, and by the time Walsingham took up office in 1573, Ireland had become a source of endless local wars and rebellions and a massive drain on the English exchequer to finance the garrison there. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, at home in England, Mary Stuart, the former Queen of Scotland, was under house arrest in northern England, having fled there in the late 1560s after earning the antipathy of virtually the entire political establishment in Scotland. Her infant son, James, had subsequently been made king of a newly Protestant Scotland. Yet Mary's presence in England posed a threat to the safety of the Elizabethan regime, for she was a zealous Roman Catholic. This would not have mattered if Queen Elizabeth had married and produced her own heirs. However, she had shown a reluctance to marry, and despite numerous esteemed suitors, still had not done so by 1573, when Walsingham became secretary. If she did not marry soon and have children, Mary, Queen of Scots, would stand in line to the throne. Hence, with this dangerous Catholic in the midst of England's political situation, did Walsingham take up his position as Secretary of State late in 1573. Given all of these threats, it is unsurprising to learn that one of the foremost activities which Walsingham pursued over a 17-year period as Secretary of State was in developing a network of spies and secret agents. He had already engaged in this work in the 1560s. Now, with the full resources of a senior government position behind him, he began employing people widely within England and on the continent to become agents and report back to him, all with the goal of preserving the Protestant settlement in England. Walsingham literally had dozens of individuals on his payroll, some of them travelling to Rome itself, where they functioned as double agents, inveigling their way into the confidence of the communities of the English Catholic exiles in the Eternal City. From there and other cities like Paris and even Madrid, these individuals sent back reports to Walsingham in England, often written in cipher, where the people who they were reporting on were given code names from ancient Greek and Roman history. As a result, today, an individual can consult documents in the National Archives in London, where the actions of people like Julius Caesar or Hannibal and Alexander the Great can be read about as though they lived in 16th century Rome. If a document or legend which explains the ciphers and the code names has survived, we could decipher them and discover who was actually being reported on back to Walsingham in England. But often the contents of these clandestine reports remain impenetrable, as they were designed to be. Walsingham's role as a spymaster will be explored more in detail when we turn to events in the 1580s. In the immediate term after his appointment in 1573, his primary concern was with Ireland. The financial drain of the neighbouring island had become intolerable during this period, and Walsingham was tasked with devising a new policy for the island after Cecil, who had dominated Irish policy in the 1560s, effectively took a back seat on it in the 1570s. Walsingham began his efforts by setting up a client network there of officials loyal to him and serving in both Dublin, the seat of the colonial government, and wider afield in the provinces. Generally, his approach was more aggressive than what Burghley had favoured in the 1560s. Where some talk of accommodating the dozens of Irish lords had been entertained in years gone by, Walsingham was responsible for promoting a cadre of military hardliners in the second half of the 1570s, who governed the country from garrisons in the provinces, operating under commissions of martial law. In tandem, he began soliciting officials in Dublin to write to him with comprehensive plans for how to reduce the country fully to English rule, and there is direct evidence of Walsingham having confidences with the Queen on these matters. They were to no avail in the short term, though. As we will soon see, Walsingham's interventions in Ireland proved unfruitful. In England, from 1577 onwards, there was a renewal of the issue of Elizabeth's marital status. By then, she was into her mid-40s, and her childbearing years had passed. As a result, a marriage was not now being considered as a means of securing the succession. Instead, Elizabeth and her advisers, such as Cecil and Walsingham, were concerned more with how the Queen could hold out the prospect of marriage as a means of forging a powerful military alliance and so strengthen England's hand against its enemies in Madrid and Rome. There really was only one clear suitor at this time: Francis, Duke of Anjou and Alençon, the brother of King Henry III of France. He was born in 1555 and was nearly half Elizabeth's age. However, England was threatened by Spain, and France was riven internally, and the possibility of an alliance was worth a peculiar marriage. Negotiations were underway for several years in the late 1570s. Walsingham was at best tepidly in support of the marriage. His view of the French had been coloured by what he had witnessed in Paris on St Bartholomew's Day in 1572, and he did not perceive them as a potentially reliable ally. Instead, what he, Cecil, and others had been preparing for many years was the possibility that if Elizabeth died without a clear successor, and if the security of the Protestant state was threatened, they would temporarily bring into being what was known as the res publica, or Commonwealth. We would call it a republic today. The possibility of having to bring such a res publica into being would continue to hang over the reign. Eventually, the marriage negotiations with Anjou broke down, and Elizabeth never married. When it came to affairs such as the marriage negotiations with the French or the management of Irish policy, these were not handled solely by the Queen, but through her direct interactions with Cecil, Walsingham, and a few other ministers. The body that governed England at the time, and which Walsingham had become a key member of in 1573, was the English Privy Council. This was a forerunner and the prototype for the modern government cabinet, though it was not forged by Parliament, but rather consisted of anywhere between 12 and 24 officials who were appointed by Elizabeth on the advice of her other ministers. It generally consisted of a mix of a few of the earls and lords of the realm who had political and administrative ability, men like Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and officials like Cecil and Walsingham, who hailed from the gentry and were often well-educated humanists and lawyers. It was with these individuals, sitting around tables at Westminster and Greenwich Palace, that Walsingham spent much of his time with in the 1570s and 1580s. As Secretary of State, he had a role in managing the affairs of the Privy Council, though the practicalities were increasingly handled by a number of clerks, one of whom, Robert Beale, was married to Walsingham's wife Ursula's sister Edith, and so was Walsingham's brother-in-law. Beale also occasionally acted as understudy as Secretary of State for Walsingham during several bouts of extended illness which he suffered from in the 1580s. Walsingham's wider job as Secretary of State required a methodical nature. He was tasked with handling more bureaucracy and correspondence than any other individual within the English government. From Ireland alone, for instance, there are thousands of letters either addressed to or sent from Walsingham between 1573 and 1590. While He also handled correspondence from dozens of ambassadors, diplomats, and spies across Europe. Many of these letters have ended up in amongst the state papers in the National Archives in London, though the exact extent of Walsingham's writing is not known, as his own personal papers have been largely lost. What we can be sure of is how methodical he was. A daybook, or catalogue, which he kept of his papers in his home on Seething Lane in London, and which has survived down to the present time in the British Library, provided lists of folders of documents categorised according to whether they related to Ireland, England, Scotland, France, and a wide range of other areas, a level of administrative sophistication which was not common anywhere in Europe at the time. And it was not simply that he brought a unique level of organisation to his role. He also had folders full of policy papers and treatises which had been sent to him by officials in the provinces, each seeking to influence policy formation at the centre of the state. He was, in short, a policy wonk and a workaholic before those concepts had names. Walsingham's fastidious nature and obsessiveness were necessary attributes in maintaining his position as the second most powerful politician in England, junior only to Sir William Cecil. His power was certainly not based on his relationship with the Queen. Although numerous films and popular accounts of Queen Elizabeth I's life and reign have depicted her relationship with Walsingham as an almost affectionate one, this was not the case. He loathed her inability to make decisions and her tendency to both procrastinate and change her mind about policies over and over again, something which every member of the Privy Council had to contend with. Her unwillingness to spend money was also a point of contention. Elizabeth ran a tight ship when it came to expenditure, something which hamstrung ambitious officials like Walsingham. They also clashed on religion. Elizabeth was a very mild Protestant, one who enjoyed the pageantry and ritual of Catholicism, but was unwilling to rule under the thumb of Rome. Walsingham was a Puritan. All of this could create tension. He once exclaimed that each of Elizabeth's most senior officials would prefer to live in Ethiopia in Africa rather than serve under her, so impossible was she to work with, while Elizabeth once threw a slipper at him and called him a protector of heretics in reference to his support for the Puritans in Parliament. When things were especially bad between them, he feigned ill health so that he could absent himself from court and work from his house in London without having to deal with what he perceived as her difficult personality. However, while there might not have been warmth at times, there was respect between monarch and minister, and for all his proclamations of his desire to live in Ethiopia, he served her loyally as secretary for the better part of 2 decades. The extent of the manner to which Walsingham had to constantly be at his desk writing became evident when a major emergency erupted in Ireland in the summer of 1579. It was wrought by the arrival back in Munster and the south of the country of James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, an Anglo-Irish lord who had left for the continent half a decade earlier to solicit aid for what he advertised as a Catholic crusade back in Ireland. He arrived in his native Munster in the summer of 1579 with a small contingent of Spanish troops which had been paid for by Pope Gregory XIII. Fitzmaurice's arrival triggered a wider rebellion in Ireland, which was soon joined by the Earl of Desmond, the most powerful lord of Munster. The Desmond Rebellion would drag on for the next 4 years, requiring the infusion of thousands of troops into Ireland. Walsingham was at the very heart of managing the war effort in London. He had dozens of correspondents in Ireland who updated him on military and administrative affairs, while he was also heavily involved in everything down to sending gunpowder to Ireland and managing the supply of food for the soldiers in Munster from the western ports of England and Wales. Today, things like this would be performed by entire departments of bureaucrats during wartime. Walsingham handled a large amount of it himself from Whitehall or his house in London, armed with little more than a quill and inkpot and a small staff of clerks. It eventually worked out. In 1583, the rebellion was finally suppressed. Desmond was killed in Munster, and the extensive lands of the Earl and his allies were soon being prepared for an English plantation which would bring in English settlers. Walsingham was also heavily involved in organising this Munster plantation from London. These were personally difficult years for Francis. His younger daughter, Mary, died in 1580 at 7 years of age. This was not a wholly unusual development. Children had a 30% or so chance of dying in early modern times before they reached their teenage years from a range of different illnesses or conditions, which vaccines, antibiotics, and modern medicine have rendered largely harmless. It is hard to assess how he took her passing, as while there is no shortage of letters written by Walsingham in the state paper archives, these were business papers. His personal correspondence, in which he might have revealed his sorrow, is largely lost, while Francis's wife, Ursula's reaction is completely unknown. While we know a lot about the wives of certain leading officials at this time, notably Mildred Cecil, Sir William's wife, Ursula Walsingham is a mystery who history has left little record of other than her marriage. 3 years after Mary's passing, Francis's other daughter, Frances, married Sir Philip Sidney, one of the great poets of the English Renaissance and the author of A Defence of Poesy and The Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. Francis arranged the marriage, which the Queen had been opposed to, in order to cement a political alliance with the faction which surrounded the Earl of Leicester and the Sidneys. Yet Sir Philip would be dead just 3 years later, and Frances would marry Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, thereafter latterly a partial inspiration for Shakespeare's Hamlet. It was a colourful marital life for the spymaster's daughter. Around the same time that Frances Walsingham was marrying Sir Philip Sidney, her father was uncovering one of the most serious plots against the Elizabethan government that it faced. This centred on Sir Francis Throckmorton, a member of a prominent northern family who had grown up to be a Catholic and had fallen under the influence of extremist English Catholic exiles in Europe while visiting the continent in the early 1580s. In 1583, Throckmorton returned to England with a plan to depose or kill Queen Elizabeth, free Mary, Queen of Scots, from the house arrest she had been under in northern England since the late 1560s, place her on the throne, and then begin restoring England to the Roman Catholic fold. In this, he was aided by elements within the French government and the French ambassador in England. But Walsingham was always one step ahead of him. A secret agent that he had placed in the household of the French ambassador to England, where he lived near Fleet Street in London, managed to acquire details of the plot and related them to Walsingham. Before his plan could ever be brought to fruition, Throckmorton was arrested and questioned under torture. He revealed extensive details of the plot, while Walsingham also employed several other agents to determine the extent of both French and Spanish involvement in the plot. Throckmorton was executed in the summer of 1584 following a trial. Perhaps most importantly, Walsingham also convinced Elizabeth in the aftermath of the Throckmorton plot to sign the Bond of Association, a legal document which granted permission to the signatories to order the murder of anyone who tried to overthrow Elizabeth henceforward. His aim in doing so seems very clear in retrospect. If Mary, Queen of Scots, was implicated in another plot like that of Throckmorton, it would provide a legal basis for executing her. The uncovering of the Throckmorton plot had graver implications still. By the time it occurred, relations between England and Spain were already at rock bottom. They had been deteriorating for many, many years, starting especially back in 1570, when Elizabeth was excommunicated with the blessing of Philip II, and when the English requisitioned a number of Spanish ships in England's ports. They deteriorated further as England provided aid throughout the 1570s to the Dutch Protestants, which were fighting what would ultimately be a successful war of independence against the Spanish in the Spanish Netherlands. Then, in the late 1570s, Elizabeth had sanctioned Sir Francis Drake, an English naval commander, to attack Spanish settlements and shipping in the Americas. He set off on a famous voyage which saw him pillage Spain's American colonies and then complete the second ever circumnavigation of the globe. In retaliation, the Spanish provided aid to the rebels in Ireland and had conspired with Throckmorton. Finally, in 1585, Elizabeth, acting on pressure from Walsingham and others, decided to sign the Treaty of Nonsuch with the Dutch rebels, and the Earl of Leicester led an English military expedition to the Low Countries. It was, effectively, a declaration of war. The First Anglo-Spanish War, as it is termed, would last for nearly 2 decades. The outbreak of war with Spain made ministers like Walsingham ever more anxious about Mary, Queen of Scots. If the Spanish managed to send a naval expedition to England and open a front there, Mary would become a focus of conspiracies to free her and place her on the throne as a Catholic who would be favourable to Spain. This was the context in which Walsingham and his spies began tracking the activities of an English Catholic by the name of Anthony Babington. Like Throckmorton before him, Babington had visited the continent, and there he had come into contact with English Catholic exiles that were plotting from Rome and other cities against Elizabeth's regime in England. In the mid-1580s, he returned to England, and he began contacting individuals connected to Mary, Queen of Scots, in coded cipher to organise a plot to free her from house arrest, assassinate Elizabeth, and have Mary claim the throne. Babington never stood a chance. From early on in the conspiracy, he was working with 2 individuals named Robert Poley and Gilbert Gifford, both of whom were double agents employed in Walsingham's spy network. Walsingham had no intention of letting Babington's plot come to fruition, but he did want it to progress far enough for him to have clear evidence that Mary, Queen of Scots, had been complicit in it. He then intended to use this evidence to call for her execution based on the bond of association that had been drawn up after the Throckmorton plot. Matters came to a head in July 1586, when Babington composed the one and only letter he is understood to have written directly to Mary. 10 days after he wrote his letter in cipher, Mary responded in code as well. Walsingham and his agents had already cracked the cipher and intercepted Mary's letter and decoded it. It was the smoking gun that was needed. In it, Mary had sanctioned Babington's plot. With this, Walsingham ordered the rounding up of Babington and his co-conspirators. A few weeks later, they were executed by being hung, drawn, and quartered, the brutal punishment for crimes of treason in early modern times. By then, Walsingham and Cecil had convinced Elizabeth to place Mary on trial. She was tried at Fotheringhay Castle in mid-October in front of a large jury of Elizabeth's ministers and the peers of the realm. Elizabeth was not present, and she never actually met Mary in person, despite her many years in England. But when the former Scottish Queen was found guilty, Elizabeth found it impossible to sanction her execution, unwilling to order the death of a fellow queen. In the end, it took until February 1587 for her to sign the death warrant. When she did, she almost immediately tried to change her mind, but discovered that Walsingham, Cecil, and the rest of the Privy Council had acted as soon as she signed the document, aware that the Queen would possibly change her mind. Mary was executed at Fotheringhay on the 8th of February 1587. Afterwards, Elizabeth was furious with her ministers, Walsingham included, though the full scale of her fury was directed at William Davison, a secretary who had conveyed the death warrant to the Privy Council as soon as she signed it. There was something of a perennial crusader about Walsingham. He had no sooner dealt with one threat to England and the Elizabethan regime when another emerged. In the case of the aftermath of the Babington Plot and Mary's trial and execution, within a short period, Francis was soon receiving a mounting number of alarming reports on Spanish preparations to send a fleet against England. Dozens of large ships were being prepared in Spanish and Portuguese ports, and further reports from the Spanish Netherlands around modern-day Belgium indicated that this Armada would travel north to the English Channel, then make landfall around Antwerp before Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, the governor of the Spanish Netherlands armies in Flanders, would board the Armada ships. It would then cross the Channel and make landfall in England. Philip II had decided he was going to conquer England once and for all. These reports were confirmed in the months that followed, and Walsingham and his associates in government soon began making preparations for the sailing of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada set sail from Lisbon in May 1588. By the time it did, Walsingham had been at full tilt for months trying to avert disaster. Some of this involved direct sabotage using his agents on the continent. A particularly shrewd move was an effort to convince the Turkish Sultan and his government in Constantinople to launch a fresh attack against Spain, the Ottomans having been at war intermittently with the Spanish across the Mediterranean for decades. Yet none of this could prevent the Armada leaving Portugal that fateful summer. Its fate is relatively well known. It made it to the English Channel, but it was never able to make landfall in the Spanish Netherlands to pick up Parma's army. Instead, after clashes with the English fleet in the Channel in August 1588, during which a young Walter Raleigh famously oversaw an operation which crashed ships that had been set alight into the Spanish ships, an unseasonable storm blew through the Channel and sent the Armada crashing northeastwards into the North Sea. Even as the storm raged, one of England's nobles wrote to Walsingham, opining that the secretary had done more with his pen to avert disaster than the commander of any ship. The emergency wasn't entirely over with the scattering of the Armada. In the weeks that followed, 24 of the Spanish ships were wrecked along the coast of Scotland and Ireland, unleashing thousands of Spanish troops onto Irish soil. Walsingham was front and centre in clearing up this mess in the weeks that followed, with correspondents furiously crossing the Irish Sea to tell local commanders, like Richard Bingham, governor of Connacht, the western province of Ireland, to identify where ships had crashed along the coast as quickly as possible and slaughter the survivors where necessary. Speed was of the essence. The Spanish could not be allowed to gather themselves in Ireland and coordinate their actions with the Irish. What followed was a ruthless but effective episode of emergency resolution, with English bands of soldiers scouring the western and northern seaboards of Ireland to kill, arrest, or otherwise neutralize the Spanish survivors. Most were apprehended or killed, though many escaped over the North Channel into Scotland and from there took ship back to Spain. A small number of stragglers were rumoured to be still in Ireland years later, teaching the Irish modern drill practices and other elements of the military revolution which had swept Europe over the last century. For months to come, Walsingham was liaising with his network of informants, attempting to discover where any of these people might be. By the time of the Armada, Walsingham, though only in his mid-50s, was suffering from increasingly poor health. In truth, he had suffered from a number of physical maladies that had grown worse over the years he served as secretary, though they never dented his ability to work. There were numerous ailments which are hard to disentangle. He suffered from kidney stones, a condition which is quite treatable today, yet which massively reduced the quality of life of those who suffered from it in early modern times. More serious still was what is assumed by historians to have been testicular cancer. This was degenerating by 1588, and in the year after the Armada, his health declined further. Nevertheless, he remained busy at his desk and directing his clerks and secretaries, maintaining a heavy correspondence through 1589, and playing a central role in providing intelligence to Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Norris, who between them led an English armada of revenge which sailed against Spain in the early summer of 1589, but which failed to seize the port of Coruña there during an assault on it from the sea. In the months after it, Walsingham's health issues became terminal. He died at home in Seething Lane, where Walsingham House now stands in central London, on the 6th of April 1590. It is an indictment of Elizabeth's perennial penny-pinching that he died with considerable debts, which were not cancelled by the Crown until the reign of King James I. He was buried the following day on the grounds of St Paul's Cathedral in the centre of the city. The stone put up to mark the site was unfortunately destroyed in the Great Fire of London of 1666, but a more modern monument at the rebuilt cathedral marks his interment there. When Walsingham died in 1590, his life's work, which was the preservation of the Protestant regime in England, was still precariously balanced. Less than 2 years earlier, the Spanish had nearly landed a massive army on English soil, and the war with Spain was still raging as the 1590s dawned. It would continue for another 14 years after Walsingham died, with new armadas threatening England's security and a Spanish expedition landing in Ireland in 1601 at the height of a new massive rebellion there, which very nearly saw English control over the island ended entirely. But the Elizabethan regime survived all of these emergencies. Ireland was brought fully under English rule in the early 17th century, albeit at enormous financial cost, and peace was achieved with Spain in 1604. Moreover, when Elizabeth died in 1603, William Cecil's son and political heir, Robert, organised for James VI of Scotland, a Protestant, to come south and succeed her. Consequently, after decades in which the security of the Protestant regime was under threat, and in which the possibility of a new reversion to Catholicism had hung over the political establishment in England, such as had occurred when Mary became Queen back in 1553, the battle which Walsingham had fought his entire political life was won. England remained a Protestant state free from the manacles of Spain and Rome. His life's work was successful, though he never lived to see it. Francis Walsingham was one of the most important political figures in England of the early modern era. As Secretary of State between 1573 and 1590, he led the English bureaucracy during a period of enormous crisis in England's ascent from being a second-tier European power to becoming one of the most important states in Europe. His life was lived around the preservation of England's status as an independent Protestant country, and he performed his duties as Secretary of State with that goal ever in mind. A man of seemingly limitless energy and zeal for administration, he took on a huge range of duties, from managing Irish policy, overseeing many foreign embassies and liaising with other members of the Privy Council, to everything from finances to religious policy. Perhaps his greatest role was as Elizabethan spymaster, and Walsingham has a claim to being the man who founded the English secret services. Not everything he did was successful, and there was a ruthlessness to Walsingham which was unpleasant in many ways. The secretary having effectively entrapped Mary, Queen of Scots, and caused her execution, while in Ireland he patronised the rise of a cadre of brutal military commanders who deliberately fomented wars with Irish lords that they displaced thereafter. Yet his methods were also often successful, and his influence was such that, barring Sir William Cecil, there was no more influential a political figure in England during the long reign of Queen Elizabeth than Walsingham. What do you think of Sir Francis Walsingham? Were his efforts to undermine Mary, Queen of Scots, unwarranted, or were they consistent with his efforts to protect the Elizabethan regime at home and abroad? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.